What did Jesus say about? Another presentation in the series. And in this presentation we're going to be looking at what Jesus said about leadership. A big issue in today's world. It's been a big issue down throughout time. Today we have dictatorships, or elected dictatorships. Somebody is at the top with all power. There are people around them who do what they're told. And the population doesn't really matter too much at all. In Islamic states, they've got what we call theocracy. In many of them there are elected leaders, but those who can stand for election are carefully selected. But there's a religious leader or leaders sitting behind it all. They may have a parliament or some kind of assembly, but sometimes just a rubber stamp. The population do what they're told. The real power rests there. They claim it's God's law, Sharia law. But in fact it's the leadership, the religious leadership, who take the decisions. In our own country we have a First Minister. We have government ministers. We have a parliament. We have civil servants. And we have the population that will throw out a parliament and elect a new one every few years. Leadership in a kind of a way is distributed, but in fact a lot of the power rests with a few individuals. Much of the power is hidden and rests with civil servants. In the Roman Catholic Church, we have the Pope, surrounded by cardinals selected by the Pope. There's quite a large number of what we might call religious civil servants who kind of do the spade work. Then there's a hierarchy of priests with various ranks. And then there's a population of Catholic people. This is very much along the lines of a hierarchy, top to bottom. If the Pope decides, it's passed down. The people follow. Here are some of the models that we have in the world today. The real big question for us today is, what did Jesus actually say about this whole question of leadership? How did he see leadership among his followers? Are any of these models close to it at all? How did he see leadership? After a period of time, the group of disciples that were around him, they kind of sensed his glory and his power. They realized this Jesus is something different. Someone different. And we're part of his entourage. We're around him. They sensed his glory and power, and they started to jockey for power and influence around him. If you like, who's going to be second in command? Who's going to be top dog? It came to a head at one point. And we have the story of how Jesus reacted. You find it in Matthew 20 and parallel passages in the other Gospels. I'm picking out just a small part of this. Jesus said to the disciples, he laid it down, he really laid it on the line for them. He said, you know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Now, by rulers of the Gentiles, he's really focusing on the Roman overlords, because they ruled everything. Gentiles just non-Jew. Then he says, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man, that's me, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It doesn't come across to us just the sheer starkness of what Jesus was saying, how it must have hit home to these early disciples, because he uses two words. One word is built around servant or serving or serve. And that word carries the meaning that we serve others simply because they've got needs. We don't expect any reward, any status, any position, any return. We simply serve others. We see someone who's got a need and we serve it. We try to help them. Now that kind of serving is utterly foreign to the cultures of the time of Jesus. Indeed, it's utterly foreign in most cultures of the world today. We serve others simply because they've got a need and we're trying to try and help them. We don't expect anything back. But there's an even more stark word: slave. The Roman Empire was built on slavery. And people were put into slavery, and when you were a slave, you had absolutely no rights at all. Your master or your mistress could order you to do things, and to do them for as long as it took, as long as they wished, and you had no control. You just had to do what they said with total obedience. And there were draconian punishments up to the death penalty if you didn't do what you were told. Now Jesus is saying to his followers, servant, slave. That would have hit the disciples hard, because they had seen the powerful effects of Roman slavery and its brutality. Totally radical. This is a different mindset altogether. We have to look at what this means for us today. In the world of Jesus, in the world of the disciples, when Jesus was teaching them about leadership among God's people, amongst his followers, they only had two models of leadership. There was the kind of Roman model, often referred to as Gentiles, and there was the Jewish model of leadership. Now, which way were they to go? Did either of them give a model that was useful? The Romans imposed their leadership by force. We'll bring peace, but you do it our way. And conquered peoples were very often forced to be slaves, or selected groups of them were. And obedience was enforced brutally. And the slaves knew they just had to do what they were told. They had no rights. There was a ruling class, and it imposed its will by force. In Jewish leadership, there was a kind of inner self-appointed group, a ruling class again. They saw themselves as a kind of superior group. Now you can see it from time to time in the gospel stories. The Pharisees looked down on the rest of the population. The Sadducees, the other religious group who held greater leadership power, they were similar. We're superior, we know what's best, do what you're told. Didn't so much do it by force, they didn't have the power to do it. But they could make life pretty grim for you. They laid down the rules, and they expected the people to do it. Jesus stood against that, and he did not become popular with the ruling classes. In God's kingdom, amongst God's people, there's a radically different value scale. In God's eyes, every one of us is of equal value. There is no ruling class. There is no hierarchy. It's a different ballpark altogether. Now let's just look at it and compare the way human structures tend to think of leadership and the way Jesus thought about it in his kingdom. Leadership's authoritarian. Someone is appointed by all sorts of mechanisms. It may even be democracy, but they have authority. And there are ranks. The person at the top delegates down the ranks, and it's top down. And your position in the ranks is important, your status. And you can see it in our ruling classes today in the Parliament in London, for example. There are hierarchies. People are responsible to people above them. And there are chains of command. Now, there are areas of life when you need this kind of, for example, in the armed forces. But that's a kind of human structure. But look at the last sentence. Too often, this kind of structure, when it moves into society and into Christian groups, religious groups of any sort, we end up with people competing to gain the most. Decisions are taken in the light of what suits us best. Now look at God's kingdom. Leadership is servanthood. That's what Jesus was saying. Servanthood. We serve others simply because they have a need. We're all of equal value. We don't need status. Our status rests in Jesus. He has accepted us as we are. We are all part equally in God's kingdom. There's no hierarchies. There's no chain of command. Doesn't work that way. Jesus is Lord. Together we follow him. If you like, we work together. We compete together to find his ways and to do it his ways. But again, look at the last line. It gives you the contrast. We compete to serve the needs of others. That's very different from the human structural way. We put others first. Whereas in the human structures, it's too easy to put ourselves first. We decide what's best for others because it's best for us. And we do it unwittingly. Now that's crept into church. Churches throughout the world. But that's not the way of Jesus. You see, that's human thinking. And that's Jesus thinking. And they are very different. And Jesus, when he was faced with this with his disciples, was pretty blunt. And he must have rocked these people back, challenging all their preconceived ideas about leadership. Could summarize it this way: the followers of Jesus live to serve others. And we do that because that's what Jesus did, and that's what it said at the end. He came to serve and to give his life a ransom. What he allowed himself to go through wasn't pleasant, and that's an understatement. But he did it for the benefit of humankind. We're familiar with these words, these wonderful words that Graham Kendrick has penned in his song. From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled, not to be served, but to serve, and give your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. This has nothing to do with worship as we see it normally. This is the real meaning of worship, which is living. We live to serve others. I'll just stop for a minute. That's the driving force We live to serve others. And that puts leadership into a totally different perspective. Let's go back to human thinking and Jesus thinking. We can summarize it that way. Even though we don't always admit it, in human thinking, essentially, we're competing to serve our needs. Now you can see it in the political parties of various styles and thinking. It's covered up by doing the will of the people, but in fact it's competing to serve the needs of those who are in the leadership classes. That's where it so often ends up. You can see it very, very strongly in the dictatorships of the world or the Islamic states of the world. The leaders do very well out of it, because in leading they're competing to serve their own needs. That's the radical way of Jesus. That is true leadership. That's what Jesus taught about leadership. And he calls all of us to follow in the footsteps of the servant king, Jesus, who stepped aside from his glory, not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. And he calls us now, all of us, to follow him. The next presentation we're going to look a bit further about what Jesus said about baptism.